In this update, we've got a powerful cross-country storm system that's going to bring some heavy snow, severe weather, and even some flooding rain. So let's take a look at the vorticity map this afternoon, and there it is. This low pressure center is just now kind of getting its act together, going to be coming inland. We're going to bring in some very heavy rains across the coastal regions into the Pacific Northwest. But this storm system is going to be continuing to strengthen, bringing some heavy snows across the Rockies, and then some severe weather into the Central Plains, as well as even just some heavier rains and even some flooding rains going into the Northeast. We also have Category 2 Hurricane Lydia out here in the Eastern Pacific. That's going to be setting its sights on Puerto Vallarta. But some of this energy is actually going to get pulled in to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's going to be traversing across, extending those heavier rains into Florida. In fact, they do have Invest 93L that the National Hurricane Center has highlighted a 30% probability of forming. So it's going to, it's going to be running out of time. It's got a lot of wind shear is going to be associated with this, but it is expected to continue to bring some heavier rains inland into the southeast, especially into Florida, as it's going to be crossing over back over into the Atlantic. And here is your wind shear map, folks. Look at the red. That is extremely unfavorable conditions. So I'm really not expecting this thing to form into a tropical entity or into a storm. But regardless, it is going to bring some heavier rains into the south coast of Texas here, and into portions of the southeast, and especially into Florida over the next couple of days. So if you are new to the channel and like detailed weather breakdowns, hit the subscribe button and you're in. You get all my daily content on this channel. And I would love to reach 225,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and you can help me get there by subscribing to the channel and following all my daily breakdowns. So let's take a look at the hazard map this morning, because we did have a powerful low pressure center up along the Great Lakes that's bringing the coldest air of the season. In fact, they've got freeze warnings this morning into a good part of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Even frost advisories extend as far south into Iowa, back into Illinois, even into central Indiana. Those temperatures are well into the 30s this morning. And we even have some winter weather advisories already highlighted across the mountain regions of Utah. And this storm system hasn't even come ashore yet. That's the one that's going to bring heavy snows across this region over the next couple of days. So here's the breakdown on the jet stream. So as we extend into tomorrow on Wednesday, we've got that low pressure center that's going to be highlighted across into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's going to be continuing to lift northeast, going to be bringing some heavier rains into the southeast and especially into Florida. All eyes will be up here into the Pacific Northwest, where extremely heavy rains going to be pounding the coastal communities. But as we go inland, that low pressure center is going to continue to rapidly deepen and produce some heavier snow. So going into your Wednesday down into the Gulf of Mexico, there is that low pressure center trying to get its act together, taking advantage of all those warm waters. Further to the north, most of this isn't actually going to be reaching the ground, but further south it definitely is, especially along the I-10, I-20 corridor and headed into Florida. So if you look at the reflectivity map, there's heavy rains extending into tomorrow for deep south Texas. We're talking places like Brownsville, into the Rio Grande Valley region, back into Del Rio, back into portions of, say, Victoria, into Corpus Christi. Those regions are likely going to be extending from some heavier rains, complements of this storm system, into the Gulf of Mexico. There's that low pressure center. That's the one that's brought down all the cooler and colder conditions for them across the upper Midwest. And then there's that other storm system, the one we're going to be tracking into the Pacific Northwest, extending those heavier rains as we go into tomorrow morning. So as we go into tomorrow afternoon, and as that low pressure continues to dive southeastward, it's going to continue to deepen, and it's going to bring some of that colder air aloft down to the surface, and that's going to be changing over that rain to snow, especially in the higher elevations in the mountain regions across Montana into Idaho, back into the Utah mountains. That's where they already have winter weather advisories in place. And those snows will continue to build across Wyoming as well as into portions of Colorado, while the heavier rains are going to be extending into the southeast by then. And all this will be now reaching the ground as all levels of the atmosphere are going to be saturated. So we could be looking at 1 to 2 inch totals across the northern tier, but further south, even some heavier, higher amounts, some 3 to 4 inches is definitely not out of the question with this particular system. And as we go into Thursday morning, so here's the formula low. It's going to continue to deepen, and once that hits the Rockies, I think we've got a pretty powerful low pressure center. Definitely a good fall event happening that's going to be coming to fruition going into that Wednesday, Thursday time frame. But we also have to be looking out for some severe weather out ahead of the storm. So here's the radar depiction as we go into Thursday. We've got the heavier rain still inundating a good part of the southeast. Those will now extend into Georgia, into the Carolinas, all the way up into portions of Virginia as the low pressure center reemerges back out here into the Atlantic. And there's the other low pressure center continuing to deepen. And as it deepens, it really elevates the snows, and those darker blues, that definitely indicates some very heavy snow and flying into Wyoming and back into Colorado, as this boundary will kind of stall out further along this area. And this is the area that could getting several inches of rain in itself as we go into Thursday, Friday time frame. But it also is going to bring a lot of winds associated with it as well. So October is typically one of those roller coaster type months. So we have these systems, and this is a formidable low pressure center that's going to be traversing across the country from northwest to all the way to the northeast. And so it's going to bring some higher winds associated with it along the way. So there's going to be pockets of heavier, higher wind gust across the Four Corners regions where this low pressure center will be traversing across. And even as the cold front will come into portions of Texas going into your later Thursday into Friday timeframe, also some higher winds. And then of course you have your own low pressure down here in the Gulf of Mexico that's going to bring some higher wind gust associated with that particular system. But out ahead of it in the warm sector, we do have a round of severe storms, likely marginal on Wednesday, but turning more severe as we get into your Thursday afternoon across portions of Omaha, back into Hastings, into Topeka region, all the way up into Wichita. Those could actually expand into the Kansas City region as we get deeper into the day on Thursday, going into the evening time frame. So definitely be on high alert. As we could be looking at some damaging winds and some larger hail associated with these particular thunderstorms. But we are going to have that low pressure center continuing to deepen. I mean, look at that low, guys. That's a 985 low pressure. That's definitely a formidable low. And going into the second week of October, we're finally seeing snow flying in the higher elevations going into Wyoming. And these could be some pretty significant totals. I mean, I wouldn't rule out even some foot totals across this region. Definitely not out of the question with this particular setup, as we'll be continuing to really lay down some heavier rains and some heavier snows across this region, as we extend into Thursday afternoon. But going into your Friday morning, look at the cold air. Look how far south it drops, all the way into Nevada, getting into Utah, even in the mountain regions of Arizona, back into New Mexico. So the seasons are definitely changing, guys. Those areas in blue actually below freezing line, and that's where the cold front will lie as we go into your Friday morning, continuing to push off to the east. And there's some preliminary snow amounts going over that, where that low pressure is going to lie. So it looks to be just kind of northeast of the Salt Lake City region into the Utah mountains. But yeah, definitely some higher elevation events. But even the mountains of Colorado, I don't think it reaches actually Denver. But just to the west of there, we could be looking at some 6 to 12 inch totals across this region. Casper, Wyoming, maybe 8 inches from this particular event, going into Rapid City, into Spearfish, even some heavier snows across this region. So definitely be on the lookout what those heavier snows just kind of coming into fruition off the Pacific Northwest, but really getting its act together going into Wednesday, Thursday, and it kind of starts to wind down on Friday. So we're going into Friday. There's the snows will be extending into the Wyoming region as that low will be traversing across. I think it's maximized by then. It'll be coming out of it, but still a formidable low of 994. As we'll watch the Invest 93L down here going out into the open waters of the Atlantic and continuing to push off well out in the open waters of the Atlantic. But that low pressure zone will be continuing to traverse across, so it brings the heavier snows across Iowa through Wisconsin, and now we'll be getting into portions of the mid-Atlantic regions back into Pennsylvania, extending all the way into Ohio region, going into West Virginia, as those tight isobars continue to tighten up and bring those higher wind gusts, and yes, even further more rains extending further south into Florida, and it's going to bring that colder air with it. So you got high pressure on the backside. Once it moves through, you got severe clear skies out, back behind it, radiational cooling. Those temperatures continue to drop. So you saw this last weekend across the deep south. You're going to be seeing it again this weekend. So that brings the nicest conditions on the weekend as those conditions, temperatures continue to drop, and it's definitely going to feel a lot like fall for sure, and even some winter in some of these higher elevations. So as we go into your Saturday afternoon, this low will be continuing to move across into the mid-Atlantic regions. Now it's going to be over portions of, say, the Buffalo region as we get into Saturday afternoon, and bring some heavy rains back in this picture. I mean, we're talking 5 out of the 6 weekends up into the Northeast. They've seen cloudy, rainy conditions, and yet we have another one coming up this weekend as we've got more rains are going to be extending into the Southeast and back into Florida again, as this low will be traversing across. But this low will continue to deepen as well, and this could be down to in the 980 range going into your Sunday time frame. Just off the Northeast coast will bring some heavier winds, especially along the coastal regions, but more heavy rains back into Jersey, back into a good part of Delaware here, into DC region, back into New York City. Just gets pounded again with more heavy rains across this region. And yeah, looking at the precipitable, percent of normal, typically what you would see this time of year, you're looking at 200 to possibly 300% of water content values across this region. So man, this area has been pounded over the last couple of months, and yes, they're looking at getting hit again hard going into this weekend with this formidable low pressure going to be moving across. But once this moves out, heading into your later Sunday, going into your Monday time frame, there's going to be extremely dry air continue to push southbound. Once that cool front moves through, replacing it with drier air, and that settles all the way down into deep Florida and actually going into Cuba, and will bring some of the coolest anomalies of the season for the Southeast. This is going to be some really chilly times coming up going into the early part of next week, as your temperatures are going to be dropping 10, 15, upwards to almost 20 degrees below average at times. And even Florida, up the entire state, gets into the action with this particular, low temperatures. And heading into the middle of next week, by the 18th, as you wake up on Wednesday, look how cold it gets into the Southeast, folks. Those are 40s all the way into South Georgia, into South Alabama. Even the Florida Panhandle will be seeing mid to upper 40s. Even Central Florida, we're right at 50 degrees. How often do you see this for the middle of October? That is definitely some chillier air will settle all the way down into Fort Lauderdale, into Miami, with checking in the upper 50s. So that's definitely cold for them. But here's the breakdown over the next 10 days. So you can see the evidence of the cross-country storm. Very heavy rain going to be extending across the coastal communities into the Pacific Northwest. You see this 4, 5, 6, 8 inches of rainfall over the next 7 to 10 days is definitely not out of the question. Some lighter amounts as you extend further inland. But where that low pressure center traverses across and the front kind of stalls out for a period of time, we could be looking at a 2 to 4 inch swath across these regions of the Dakotas, into Minneapolis, into Iowa here, through Illinois, into Wisconsin. back into Michigan and all the way through Ohio here, traversing across into Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, back into Long Island regions. Those areas could be looking at 2 to 4 inches of rain. And then of course further south with Invest 93L, most of the heaviest rains will be extending into the Gulf of Mexico. But once you push inland, yeah, some of those 1 to 3 inch totals could easily come to fruition down here into the southeast, but especially into Florida. And notice the dry slot for a good part of the southwest, and much of Texas and Oklahoma continues to remain on the drier side for the next 7 to 10 days. So guys, I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch me next update where I protect you before and after the storm.